Well, today we look at the crossing of the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds as it really should be spoken of. I want to do a couple of things today. I want to do a bit of an introduction, and then I'd like to look at the text as we have it. What is the text? And the third thing, I'd like to look at a few things within it, a little bit of exegesis, and then finally a brief conclusion. So, the introduction. Here we come, in Exodus 14 especially, to the second of the great acts of Yahweh for the deliverance of the Jewish people, the crossing of the Sea of Reeds. The Hebrew text says the Sea of Reeds. The Septuagint, the Greek version, had the Red Sea. But we think that's a bit dramatic. We think the Sea of Reeds is probably it. Certainly that's what the Hebrew says. Now, this crossing of the Red Sea is very intimately connected with the previous great deliverance of the Jewish people, and that is the slaughter of the firstborn of Egypt and the salvation of God's firstborn, the firstborn of the sons of Israel. We see again the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. As in all the plagues, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. We hear again the cry of the sons of Israel for deliverance. And God's partisanship for the Jewish people, he takes their side against the Egyptians, so that the Egyptians ultimately will know that Yahweh is the true God. Second thing to say is, and that's something more for us, the first of these two great episodes, the Passover, remains at the heart of our Mass. The Passover meal gives us the basic structure of our Mass. And of course, the original Mass, the Last Supper, was the Passover meal, more than likely. And at that Mass, every Holy Thursday, we have as our first reading Exodus chapter 12, which is the Passover meal. But the second of these great events, the crossing of the Red Sea, of the Sea of Reeds rather, becomes the most powerful Old Testament foreshadowing of the sacrament of baptism. Water is used in both. And we cross into the promised land as the Jewish people crossed over from slavery into freedom, so do we. And at the Easter Vigil, the one reading that's absolutely necessary is Exodus 14, the crossing of the Red Sea. And the psalm to respond to that is the psalm from Exodus 15. We know that in the 2nd century, the Easter Vigil focused on the Passover lamb. You might remember a few weeks ago we read Melito of Sardis. That was his homily at the Easter Vigil. But in the 4th century by then, when the church had stacks of converts through the RCIA, then the Easter Vigil became very baptismal. And so we moved from Exodus chapter 12 as the fundamental reading to Exodus chapter 14. So, for Mass and for baptism, our two fundamental sacraments, we go back to the book of Exodus. Now, we really don't know what happened. I guess you're used to me saying that now, because of the different generations coming and adding their piece and so on. But some people would say that, for example, the Sea of Reeds, what was that? That's probably one of the tidal lakes that are close to the Mediterranean Sea. And tidal lakes, as you know, can easily, the wind can blow, and when the tide goes out, the land becomes dry, and the tide can sometimes come rushing back. So that's possible. When did it happen? Well, there is the mention for the first time of the Israelite people outside the Bible from a Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh is named Meneptah, and he lived from 1213 to 1203 BC. So roughly around the year 1200, it's possible that the Jewish people are back home then, and that the Exodus is over, because they're mentioned in a steel monument under that particular Pharaoh that they are in Israel. So it happened before that. Did I say that clearly enough? You can cut that out if you like. So, just a final thing by way of introduction. There is a way of looking at this whole crossing of the Red Sea which parallels the crossing of the River Jordan. In fact, when we get to the crossing of the River Jordan, when we do the book of Joshua in a few years' time, you'll notice that there are many parallels in that to the crossing of the Red Sea. And it just may be that they're two sort of bookends for the story of the journey from the Jewish people from Egypt to the Promised Land. That's another way of looking at this particular episode. So that's by way of introduction. Now, what is our text? The second thing we're going to do. Chapter 13, verse 17 onwards, and chapter 14 is the narrative. We're back into narrative. And chapter 15 is the liturgical text, the poem, the hymn of thanksgiving. So, what about this narrative now from chapter 13, verse 17, all through 14? We have to say it's a compilation of the three traditions of J, E and P, and an earlier generation actually put them out into the J, E and P. And I'd like to just do that for you in a moment, because it's possible to distinguish the three different emphases of these people, and it's good for us just to see that J's view of what happened is different from P's. But we have to remember that it's not as though we've got three different documents and they've put them together, but it's been welded together over generations. So we're not looking so much at the details of each verse, we're just looking at the emphases in each particular story. So for example, J will say, "The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land." That fits in with the tidal lake. P will say, in a much more dramatic fashion, because priests are much more dramatic, the priestly school is much more dramatic, "Stretch out your hand over the sea and it will dry up." And the waters formed a wall to the left and a wall to the right, and the Jewish people went through. The Cecil B. DeMille's version. That's the priestly version. So we'll just now take a little bit of a look at that text. And I'll read firstly the J version, and then I'll read the P version, just to give you a sense of the two different stories. Here's the J version, which is the simpler version, the more naturalistic explanation of what happened. In front of Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, you shall encamp over against it by the sea. The mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed towards the people, and they said, "What is this we have done, that we have to let Israel go from serving us?" So he made ready his chariots, and took 600 picked chariots, and the Egyptians pursued them, and overtook them encamped by the sea, by Pi-hahiroth, in front of Baal-zephon. Forgive my poor enunciation there. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after